Hello, everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to start looking at the way this country actually gets on the path to a civil war. And kind of keep in mind, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, you kind of have to think about this as how do you get to that point, right? And the only way that you could actually see your neighbor as an enemy, right, is if you see them as something different than you, as something not like you. And that's the process that we're going to kind of look at today, as we're going to see how these differences that have been there all along in this country are really becoming magnified here. And they set this country really on a path to a civil war. That's why we call this lecture the path to disunion. That's why historians kind of look at this period we're going to study after the war with Mexico and that ramifications of all this new territory added to the country, what it means to the United States, right? And what we're going to see is the North and South aren't able to kind of come together and kind of come to agreement anymore. They're finding it harder and harder to compromise on what's best for everybody. They really just want what's best for them. And that's what you need to have a civil war, right? You have to see the other side as their wins are not your wins, right? What's good for them is bad for you, and that sort of thing. And that's what we're going to kind of look at today. And kind of keep in mind, we kind of saw this coming in our last lecture. Originally, in the early 19th century, most Americans could galvanize around this idea of manifest destiny, that the United States was a special nation, had a special mission in the world. We were kind of an example for all other nations to follow. Our political system that offered more opportunity and freedom to people, at least in theory, right? And of course, Americans kind of extolled those things. They wanted to be this example. So for a lot of Northerners, it meant moral reform, making the country a better country, right? Those religious revivals, firing up a lot of people to do those things. But manifest destiny meant more than that as well, right? It meant expanding the nation, bringing these things that we're known for, this moral reform, this better nation, right, to more parts of the world, especially the North American continent. So in the early 19th century, what most Americans could kind of agree on is this country needed to get bigger. And as we mentioned last time, they do, right? They push northwards, they put southwards, taking places like Florida, parts of Canada in the north, but really they focus westwards. The West is the area of opportunity. It's a place to kind of start over. It's a place of mystery and wonder, right? All kinds of natural resources. So Americans really started heading out west, even if it meant going into other people's countries and taking that land, right? What had been part of the Spanish Empire was now Mexico, or was claimed by Britain or Russia, right? The Oregon territories. The United States just pushed into those areas and began taking them over, and even fought a war against Mexico when Mexico really didn't do anything but defend itself, right? The United States is so caught up in this idea of manifest destiny that they basically engineer a war under James K. Polk to take half of Mexico. And of course, that changes the trajectory of both of those countries' histories, the United States and Mexico. Mexico losing half of the northern half of its country is going to lose a tremendous amount of wealth and opportunity that now goes to the United States. On the other side, the United States is going to have all that wealth. Keep in mind what we talked about last time. Right after the war is over and the peace deal signed, come reports of discovery of gold in California to the tune of about $400 million worth in their terms from about 1850 to about 1890, early 1900. That's about $400 billion in gold in our terms today. So it's an incredible amount of money that's going to be pouring out of the West, right? And then you add on places like Arizona and Nevada that have their own mineral-rich deposits to be worked as well. There is an incredible amount of wealth out for the taking out west in the minds of a lot of Americans. So of course they head out west, and a lot of people flock to California to get rich quick. This idea of what the West is all about to a lot of Americans. And they come out in such huge numbers that within just a few months of the discovery of gold, California already qualifies to be a state. And of course, it kind of takes it upon itself to decide what kind of state it's going to be, whether it's going to be a slave state or a free state. And as we mentioned and talked about last time, they choose to be a free state. So what we have to do today is kind of figure out, where do the people living in California get the idea that they can make that decision, right? And of course, what we also want to look at, besides where these ideas are coming from, is what their impact is, okay? So today, to kind of explain how we get to this point where this nation's starting to diverge in two distinct separate sections that kind of see each other kind of warily, maybe distrustful of each section, right? The North doesn't trust the South, South doesn't trust the North anymore. It's just it just takes a few things to really kind of tip that over into outright dislike or hatred towards each other. All right, and we'll kind of see how that builds up here in the middle of the 19th century as we head towards the Civil War. So what we're going to do is look at this thing called the Compromise of 1850 that brings California in as a state. And if you stop and think about what just that means, right? The idea that they actually are so divided right now that it's hard to bring in a state now, right? It was kind of like that in 1820. But they were able to find a compromise pretty cleanly. We're going to bring, in 1820, they said, let's bring in Missouri as a slave state, but we'll also bring in a free state. And they drew a line on a map to kind of answer that question once and for all. But here in the Compromise of 1850, it is not that simple. It is not that easy. And the ramifications of that compromise, trying to bring California in as a state, is going to lead to even further problems. So as you kind of see here in our list of sections of this lecture, there's a lot going on here in just a 10-year period. And we're not even going to look at the entire 10 years in this lecture. It is just that full of important moments, right? Starting with kind of this aftermath of the war with Mexico, and what happens after that in kind of succession. We'll kind of see the dominoes falling here all throughout the 1950s as these two sections start to move away, and will culminate in two of the biggest moments of the 1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and how it actually leads to Americans shooting at each other, killing each other, and then one of the biggest legal blunders in the Supreme Court history, the Dred Scott decision, that fuels that fire even more, right? So we'll kind of walk our way through all of this and kind of explain how convoluted all of this is, how confusing it can kind of be, and just how distrustful Northerners or Southerners are becoming of each other during this period, right? So let's start with this thing called the Compromise of 1850, right? This deal that has to be worked out to bring in California as a free state. And again, we have to kind of think about that, right? Why did California think it had a right to become a free state, right? Where did it get that idea from? Because if you kind of stop and think about it, that's not the way this has happened before with all this Western territory. When the country was first created in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, we had up to the Mississippi River as our western boundary. But really, the eastern half of that country is what was settled by Americans. So they had to decide what was going to happen to all of this western territory at that time. And they decided to split it geographically under the Articles of Confederation in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. They used the Ohio River Valley as their boundary. North of it would be free territory, south of it would be slave territory. You didn't have a choice. It was decided by the government, right? By the national government. Again, when the Louisiana Purchase territory is acquired, they draw a line on a map after adding Missouri and Maine to kind of balance out the U.S. Capitol, right? The House and the Senate. They say the rest of that territory is going to be divided. But this time, right? And this is what a lot of the critics of the Mexican War were talking about, right? This time, it's hard to compromise, right? They could have taken the Missouri Compromise line here, the 3630 line, and extended it all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, saying that, you know, everything north of that line would be free, everything below it would be slave. But they can't do it this time. The people of California are finding gold everywhere, and they want it to be slave-free, right? If you're a Midwesterner, somebody from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, even Kentucky and Tennessee, right? Most of the people heading out here are people that don't own slaves, and they don't want slave owners to come in and be able to work gold deposits, acquire a lot of money, buy more gold deposits, and force them out. Because that's exactly what Southern slave owners are doing everywhere else. They buy the best land, they push everybody else to the margins, and they keep acquiring and getting more money and building up their holdings. And it makes it harder for anybody else to be successful. So California decides for itself that it's not going to split itself in two. It's not going to be worrying about balancing it because the people of California want the opportunity for themselves. So again, where does this idea come from, right? Where do they get the idea that they can decide on a state level rather than on the national level what's going to happen in their territory? Well, that goes back to the 1848 election. Remember, I told you in the 1848 election, the Whig Party is going to run a hero of the Mexican War, Zachary Taylor, as their candidate, right? And Zachary Taylor is going to absolutely try to avoid all of this mess, right? He's going to say, I don't really have a position on what's going on in California. Uh, Ask me something else, right? And he can do this because he's seen as a national hero and he's seen as a slave owner by Southerners. They trust him. They know he owns a plantation in Louisiana, owns hundreds of slaves. They don't worry about him not defending slavery because it's good for him. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, has a problem here in 1848. They don't really have a national figure. Remember, James K. Polk is kind of sick. He wasn't that popular to begin with, even though he's incredibly successful and carries out almost everything on his agenda. He's just not liked enough, right? So he can't run for re-election in 1848. So the Democratic Party has some new faces, like the guy in the lower right here. His name's Stephen Douglas. He's from one of these new western states, Illinois, and he is rapidly becoming a big player in national politics. But he's still too young and not well known enough to run for president in his own right. So he kind of starts becoming one of the main leaders of the Democratic Party. And what he suggests is they do what's always worked before. Go out and find a war hero, run him as a national candidate, and make sure that you appeal to as many people as possible, right? As many sections of the country as possible, the West, the North, and the South. So they go and the Democratic Party recruits a guy from the War of 1812, General Lewis Cass. Now, kind of keep this in mind. If Lewis Cass is a high-ranking officer in the War of 1812, that's what made him famous. It's 30 years later, right? This guy's in his 60s, 70s now. He is not of the current war. He's not the household name he used to be, like Zachary Taylor is now after the war with Mexico. So they understand they need something else to really kind of galvanize their party and keep Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats all on board. So Stephen Douglas engineers this idea of popular sovereignty. Now, what we mean by that is, well, popular is people, right? Sovereignty means control, right? Who's in charge? So popular sovereignty is the idea that the people should make a lot of these decisions. And the biggest decision confronting the country here after the war with Mexico is over is what do we do with all the land out west? Who does it belong to? Well, yes, it belongs to the United States, but does it belong to Northerners or Southerners, right? And what Stephen Douglas is saying is let the people that move there to these territories decide for themselves. Instead of the national government drawing a line on the map like it always has before, we'll let the people living there decide for themselves what kind of state they want to be, free or slave. Now, of course, Southerners hate this because who has more people? Whose population is booming here? Well, true, every part of the country is booming in the 1840s, but really it's the North, fueled by immigration, that has way more people to send out west. People like John Calhoun from South Carolina, he sees this as horrible for the South. He knows that not enough Southerners can move westward fast enough to occupy these territories and decide what kind of state they're going to be. He kind of goes out to the Democratic convention and says, hey, look, we don't believe in this. We don't think you can tell Southerners they can't move to these territories with their slaves. We think that that's wrong. You're depriving them of their property. And they fight back against this idea of popular sovereignty. In the end, the Democratic Party, to keep Southern Democrats on board, has to take back the idea of popular sovereignty. They have to say, look, slavery needs to be available everywhere in the West, including all territories, right? As far as the Oregon Territory, right? That should all be open to slavery. That is much farther than Stephen Douglas was thinking of going. He was just talking about the Mexican cession, the areas acquired from Mexico. He wasn't thinking about the Oregon territories that we also acquired at the same time. But people like John Calhoun are saying, look, we want to be able to expand slavery anywhere and everywhere. So we see kind of this coming schism here, right, within the Democratic Party. Northern Democrats have a much more limited view of where slavery should go. Southern Democrats, of course, want to take slavery everywhere, right? Now, in the end, right, we have to kind of think about it, right? Here in 1848, the Missouri Compromise is already starting to kind of break down. They've already rejected the idea of extending the line westwards. They're saying that any of these new Western territories should be up for grabs. And honestly, Calhoun's position is even more radical than that. He's saying that maybe even the Missouri Compromise line should be erased, right? Even some of these last territories in the Louisiana Purchase territory should be open to slavery. So there's a definite divide here, right, in the country based on geography and your view towards the expansion of slavery. Now, remember, we're not talking about the abolition of slavery by any moment here, right? There are some Northerners talking about it, but they are definitely a minority still. But there is a discussion about whether slavery should be limited. And if you're a Southern slave owner, you don't like that idea because if you can limit slavery, you can decide its fate. You can decide that eventually you want to get rid of it completely, especially if more territories are settled by Northerners and become free territories. So this is a big deal, a big argument that's happening in the Democratic Party, and it makes it hard for them to kind of come together and support their candidate, Lewis Cass. Now, on the flip side, the Whig Party, again, they have a popular candidate, and he's smart. He's not going to say anything about what should happen to these Western territories. He pretty much just has no comment on it. But there are some Northern Whigs, so even the Whig Party is going to have some problem here. They're not happy with that. They want to see this limited. Remember people like John Wilmot, right? Thomas Corwin, Whigs during the war that didn't like the idea of taking all this land from Mexico just so slave owners can expand and have more wealth, more area to grow cotton or to mine gold or do whatever it is they want to do with that slave labor. So Northern Whigs don't like this position that their own party takes. And in the summer of 1848, a number of Northern Whigs start their own party called the Free Soil Party, saying that all this territory we just acquired from Mexico should be free soil, means no slavery, right? So again, if you're somebody that's moving out to California here, you're bringing this debate with you out to California in 1848 and 1849. Now, this new political party, it pretty much is still a Northern party, right? It still represents a lot of Whig ideas because it is made up of a lot of Whigs. But it also takes a clear stand on the issue of slavery, saying it shouldn't happen, right? It shouldn't expand. They're not saying get rid of it. It's not an abolitionist party, but it's definitely saying we should limit the spread of slavery. In the summer of 1848, when this party starts, they don't have a lot of figures, so they just try to find well-known names. They choose Martin Van Buren, former president of the United States, former vice president under Andrew Jackson, a big popular Democrat at one point, but his reputation was tarnished by the 1840 election, right? He really hasn't rehabilitated himself very much, and again, he's kind of a name of the past, not the present. Kind of going on with that theme, this new party, the Free Soil Party, chooses Charles Adams, the grandson of John Adams, to be the vice presidential candidate, right? So they're trying to appeal to Northerners here because this is primarily Northerners. There's no slave owner here, there's no Southerner here, right? This is a Northern party for Northerners. So even the Whig Party here in 1848 is going to have some problems, have some issues, has a split, but it's not as severe as what happens to the Democratic Party. Now, in the end, the Whig Party wins pretty convincingly if you get down to it. Almost 60% of the electoral vote. They're getting votes in the North and the South. They're getting votes in the East and the West. The Whig Party is a national party. Democrats, too. They're getting votes in the North, South, East, West, just like the Whigs. But in the end, this Free Soil Party kind of shows that there's something happening here, that this abolition movement in the North is starting to gain some traction because 12% or about 10% of the vote goes to this new party that's only been around for a couple of months, right? And they actually get some of their candidates not elected president, but elected to Congress. So this new political party actually has some political clout, has a political life here. But in the end, the Whig Party kind of wins by ignoring the issues. And this sets up an important precedent here. Most people that vote for the Whigs are voting for the Whigs because they don't have a position on this very controversial issue of what to do with all this Western land, right? What kind of states should they be? The Whigs don't want to answer that question because it will just lead to problems. It'll lead to fighting. So Americans here in the 1840s, into the 1850s, are going to try and ignore these problems, but they're not going to let themselves be ignored, right? The old saying is the more you try, when you try to ignore problems, they just get worse. They don't get better. They don't solve themselves. So we kind of see that playing out here in the 1848 election, right? And we kind of see this new party. It represents these people that in the North that are starting to kind of come to grips with this idea of slavery, right? Again, they're not abolitionists, but they can definitely see the spread of slavery as being bad for the North, right? They're people that supported the Wilmot Proviso, the idea that during the war we wouldn't take any of this Mexican land and use it for the expansion of slavery, right? And a lot of the people joining this party, voting for this Free Soil Party, they're from the Northeast, places like New York, Massachusetts, or from kind of the western part, of the Midwestern part of the country, places like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, right? So this party has some clear northern sentiments, right? It's made up of Northerners for Northerners, and it's more than just an anti-slavery party, right? It's about protecting tariffs, those Whig ideas of building railroads and canals, right? And acquiring more land and selling it cheap as possible to people settle out west, right? But it's taking a stand here on the issue of the spread of slavery. And that's important to kind of keep in mind as we move forward here, right? But it's not just an anti slavery party. Now, of course, this sets the stage for the compromise that needs to happen. When California announces itself as a free state, taking that idea of popular sovereignty from the 1848 election, even if it didn't become an official platform, it wasn't an official method of determining what happens to these territories. The people of California decide for themselves in their own state constitution what kind of state they're going to be. And of course, it just kind of leads to an already kind of bitter, acrimonious scene here on the national stage, right? In Congress, they were already arguing about other things, kind of revolving around the slavery issue. Northerners wanted to get rid of slavery in Washington, D.C. They thought it was bad for the national character, right? To have slave auctions and slave labor in the nation's capital when we say we're dedicated to the idea of freedom and equality, right? Nothing could go against that any more clearly than owning slaves. Southerners also had some issues, right? They wanted a tougher fugitive slave law. A lot of slaves, approximately about 1,000 a year, were able to escape from plantations and their owners in the South and flee to the North. Well, since the Constitution was written, there were laws in the national government that said if a slave escaped, people were bound legally to send those slaves back. But Northerners have been absolutely ignoring these laws for 50, 60 years now. And Southerners are tired of that. They're saying, hey, look, you want things, we want things, right? So when California becomes or petitions to become a state, it already finds out that the nation's already starting to divide on these other issues, right? And it's going to be hard to make this happen. And again, they have a chance here. They could just extend that line, divide California into two sections. But the people of California, when they form their government, kind of preempt any of that, right? They're saying, look, we're going to be a free state no matter what. All of it, from the entire portion, the 800-mile coastline, is going to be one free state. So into this mix, right? Southerners are saying, hey, wait a minute, there's nothing in this for us. California comes in, it upsets the balance. Now there's more free states in the Senate. California is going to have people, it's going to have representatives. That'll give Northerners more power than they already have in the House. This is bad for us. They're actually opposing adding California as a state. Northerners, on the other hand, are saying, hey, look, it's done, right? It's happened. They're happy to have California come in as a free state because it gives them more political clout. So here in 1850, there is a need for compromise. And the guy that engineered the last great compromise, the Compromise of 1820, Henry Clay kind of steps in. And what we're going to see is a lot of famous names of the early 19th century are involved in this, right? Henry Clay has been in Congress in either the House or the Senate for almost 30 years, right? This is his last hurrah. He's old, he's sick, he's going to die soon. Calhoun, the voice of the South for the last 30 years, he's going to be involved in this compromise. Daniel Webster, a famous congressman from Massachusetts, he'll be involved in trying to negotiate this, trying to find a middle ground that'll make Northerners and Southerners happy. But what they're going to find is it's getting hard to do that. In the end, uh, this compromise has to be broken down into a series of compromises. Give for Northerners, then a give for Southerners, and back and forth in this, right? Ultimately, there are going to be five parts to this compromise of 1850, five individual pieces of legislation attempting to kind of buy off Northerners, buy off Southerners, so that they'll support this compromise, get California in, and help kind of get the nation past this moment of crisis when we can't even decide if we want to bring in more Western states, right? And think about how quickly this has turned. 1838, they couldn't think of not adding territory to the United States. But Texas proved that there were limits to that. Now California is proving it again. So in this compromise, worked out between all these members of the Senate and the House, right? Uh, the one thing that everybody has to understand is California is coming in as a free state. Nobody wants to see California languish like Texas did as an independent country. Too much gold, too many people, just too valuable, right? It means that maybe that war for Mexico was for nothing if California goes off and becomes part of Mexico again or becomes its own country, right? It's not good for the United States. So in the end, that has to be a done deal, which means that's a win for Northerners. Northerners get something out of this. So something has to be given to Southerners, right? The second part of the second piece of legislation that comes out of this compromise is the idea that the rest of the territory taken from Mexico will be open to slavery. If slave owners want to move there, and the people of the territory want that territory to be slave territory, it is possible now. Again, they are not going to draw a line on the map and have the national government decide what is free and what is slave, right? The people of those territories are going to get there. That idea of popular sovereignty is kind of working its way into the system, if you will, right? Now, of course, that was the second part of this, that opening all the rest of the territory to slavery is a big win for Southerners. So Northerners want something in return for that, right? The possibility of having multiple slave states out of the Western territories is a big deal to Northerners. So, of course, they want something in return for that. They're going to get a kind of a two-stage proposal here. Northerners want to get rid of slavery in Washington, D.C., but there are too many Southerners, and Washington, D.C. is in the middle, caught between two slave states, Maryland and Virginia. So that's going to be a tough ask. So what they're able to get, Northerners are, is that the slave trade, the buying and selling of human beings in the nation's capital. And this is actually happening right across the street from the Capitol building where Congress meets on a pretty regular basis, right? Slaves are being sold all throughout the District of Columbia. Well, this is going to be part of this compromise. Northerners and Southerners will agree that the slave trade in Washington, D.C. will be stopped, and the possibility of getting rid of slavery completely within the district is also open if the residents of Washington, D.C. want to pass an ordinance in their community to get rid of slavery, right? And if they do vote to get rid of slavery and the residents there lose their slaves, free them, then those slaveholders will be compensated with monetary funds, right? So actually, there is a mechanism here still that we could end slavery on a national scale. We could do it in the nation's capital. Theoretically, we could do it everywhere. But Southerners won't buy into this. The only way they'll agree to this portion of the compromise is if they get something else. And that's what they want, is a tougher Fugitive Slave Act. One that not only forces federal officials to send back runaway slaves to their owners, but even state and local officials. State and local officials have been able to get around federal laws by saying, well, we're not federal authorities, we'll follow state and local laws. Southerners want a national law that forces state and local officials to enforce national laws. And they get that. The only way that Northerners can get abolishing the slave trade in Washington, D.C. is if they also sign on to the tougher Fugitive Slave Act for Southerners. And then again, there's a fifth one, right? One that's kind of again kind of set to appease Southerners, and that's the idea that Congress isn't going to interfere with the interstate slave trade. That is the buying and selling of human beings within the United States. In 1808, Congress had officially banned the importation of slaves from outside the United States and what's called the international slave trade, the slave trade that had originally brought enslaved Africans to the United States in the first place, or to the American colonies in the first place. So here in the 1850 Compromise, Congress is clearly being told you have to stay out of the buying and selling of human beings within the southern states. If a slave owner in Maryland or Virginia wants to sell to a cotton grower in Texas a bunch of slaves, that's his choice. He gets to do that. You can't interfere with that. The idea here is that if Southerners move out west, they can get slaves from back east to start, utilizing for mining, timber, farming, or growing cotton, whatever it might be. So here in the 1850 Compromise, we have these 5 portions that are meant to try and appease both Northerners and Southerners and Westerners and just make everybody as happy as possible. The idea being that nobody is happy with everything in this, but everybody gets something out of it. And what we find is, like most compromises, it is not loved, right? As a matter of fact, the president of the United States at the time, Zachary Taylor, that's not him in the upper right-hand corner, he says, look, I hate this compromise. He thinks it's only going to lead to more problems, especially because it kind of opens up the West to competition as to who's going to settle those territories, who's going to decide whether it's a slave or free territory. But then in September of 1850, Taylor changes his mind. Well, he doesn't change his mind. He dies, right? I think he dies of a heart attack or an infection, and he dies. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, a Northerner, has to step in and decide what to do. In the end, he has the vice president, now President Fillmore, decides, hey, look, I want to become president in my own right. I want to run again. The only way I'm going to become president is if I have the backing of Southerners. So he agrees to the compromise. He wants to keep the country kind of patched together. It'll help his political career, right? So he pushes for this compromise to pass Congress. And in the end, it does, right? Pushed over by people like Clay and Daniel Webster. Most people in Congress, enough can be convinced that this is good for the nation to make it happen. But we see some big problems still there. When California comes in, the North now controls not just the House, but now the Senate. That scares Southerners. Northerners, on the other hand, hate this new fugitive slave law. It makes them forced to return people to slavery when they say they're free states. By definition, it means if a slave gets to a northern territory, they're no longer slaves, right? They're free now if they make it to Pennsylvania or New York. So there's some big issues still to be worked out. And as a matter of fact, even as these laws are passing, this giant compromise is being passed in Congress, there are people saying this is the end, right? We can see the writing on the wall here. John Calhoun said, the South, God knows what'll become of her. With Northerners in control of Congress, they can pass whatever laws they want. Now, luckily for the South, Northerners can't agree on a whole lot of things right now. So that's not going to come to pass. And there will be another Southern slave state ready to come in pretty soon that'll balance out California and return kind of this balance to Congress. But it's scary if you're a Southerner, right? When the president dies, when Zachary Taylor dies, he's the guy you kind of counted on to look out for your interests. You don't trust Northerner Millard Fillmore, right? You think that he might go against your interests. Now, he doesn't. But the fear is, without a Southerner in the vice president's seat, you don't know what's going to happen next. The North could get complete control of the federal government. Northerners, especially that new Free Soil Party, are just as upset as Southerners, right? Free Soilers say they're exposed, right? One Free Soiler in the Massachusetts legislature says, we're opposed to slavery in every form and color, in favor of freedom and free soil where every man lives. Horace Mann, also of Massachusetts, said, under a full sense of my responsibility to my country and my God, I deliberately say better disunion, better a civil or a servile war, a slave insurrection, better anything that God in his providence shall send than an extension of the bounds of slavery. So even some Northerners are saying this is a bad deal that we've just worked out here. We don't want to see, we're maybe not ready to get rid of slavery, but we don't want the problem to get bigger and harder to solve. We don't want more slave states. So here in the 1850 compromise, people are hoping that they've settled some problems, but in reality, they've just caused more, right? This problem is not going away. Sure, California is a free state, but what's going to happen in the Oregon territories? What's going to happen in the Utah and New Mexico territories? What's going to happen with all that land that Texas claims, but maybe isn't part of Texas, right? But now that we've taken from Mexico, what do we do with all of this? What happens now? So these questions have to be answered, right? And what we'll kind of see is these issues of the Compromise of 1850 are going to keep coming back to just divide the country more and more and more. And there's one thing that really is at the heart of all of it, that really stirs things up more than anything else. Quite a few good choices here, but there's really one, and that's the tougher fugitive slave law. It really changes and forces a lot of Northerners to kind of come to grips with the idea of whether they're okay with this nation allowing slavery or not. As we'll see, this kind of plays on a lot of Northern themes, kind of goes against a lot of ideas that Northerners have kind of been building themselves up on over the last 20, 30 years, and it definitely goes against their idea of what manifest destiny means. So that takes us to this next section, right? This Fugitive Slave Act does help tear the country apart in a way, right? Maybe not in a wide scale sense, but definitely in a local sense, especially in places where the escape slave is prone to go. Because there's something at the heart of all of this that's exacerbating this problem, making it a real problem that needs to be answered. And that, of course, is a thing called the Underground Railroad. Now, this has been around for a long time, right? Since the 1790s, people have been helping slaves escape out of the South to freedom, right? Uh, so in response to slaves escaping, you've seen professional bounty catchers come up, right? People that read those advertisements in newspapers describing runaway slaves. They look for people fitting that description. They grab them off the streets and send them back to their slave owners. Sometimes even grabbing people that aren't actually the escaped slaves, they just fit the description so that they can get a reward. In response to that, right, this process of slaves escaping from the South, heading to the North, where the North is getting rid of slavery, passing laws that are emancipating slaves, right? These professional slave catchers are coming in, kind of trying to undo that process. Well, northern states, in response to these slave catchers, have passed a bunch of laws that say no. If somebody gets here and they were a slave, well, by virtue of being in our state, they're now declared free, right? We're getting rid of slavery. If you're not already a slave in this state and you get here, you're automatically free, right? That's what those personal liberty laws mean. So, of course, a professional organization, or not a professional, but a group of like-minded individuals start working to kind of make this possible, right? To get slaves from the South to the North and to freedom. That's called the Underground Railroad. It's why professional slave catchers have to kind of go around catching slaves in the North, because there are people in the South and in the North that are helping slaves escape, right? It's really a giant network of people that don't really have a lot of connections to each other in an official daily way, right? You might know what you might be a member of this organization, right? This Underground Railroad, somebody that's opposed to slavery, wants to see people escape, right? You meet a slave. That slave seems to be unhappy. That slave is somebody that seems to have a lot of opportunities to escape, right? Maybe they run a lot of errands for their owners. Maybe they're being sent on a work detail outside of their normal area. You tell them, hey, look, I know a place where you can go and hide. And then that place will tell you where the next place is to go and hide, right? So we don't know a lot about who's involved in this underground network of people, right? But we do know it's not an actual railroad. It's just a euphemism. They use a bunch of code words, right? Like stations. Stations are the houses of people or the businesses of people that want to help slaves escape. The passengers are the slaves themselves that are trying to escape to freedom. The conductors are these agents, these people involved in this process to help slaves escape from the South. And what we have to understand is there's a lot of people, both in the North and even in the South. There are a lot of Southerners that aren't okay with slavery, right? So we'll see during the Civil War, there are a lot of Southerners that are going to fight for the North, right? Hundreds of thousands, as a matter of fact. So this is a messy situation here. But as long as there have been people trying to catch slaves and send them back to slavery, there have been people trying to help them escape to freedom. We call that group of people working to free slaves from the South the Underground Railroad. And there's one place where the destination is always kind of geared towards. Not just places like New York or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, but even farther north to Canada, because it's a separate country. It's part of the British Empire. They've already outlawed slavery. And if you can get American slaves to Canada, then they can't be sent back. American laws have no power in Canada. It's a separate place, a separate country, right? So for this Underground Railroad, it's about getting people out of the South to freedom whenever, however possible, right? A famous example of this, right? And it's one of the reasons why we've decided as a kind of a national government that we were going to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill, replace slave owner Andrew Jackson with a freedom person like Harriet Tubman, because she epitomized what this was all about, right? Harriet Tubman was herself a slave in Maryland. About the same time that Frederick Douglass is escaping from slavery, she's being born in Maryland into slavery. By the 1840s, she's decided she's had enough, and she sees the opportunity and she takes it. After years of being abused, seeing family members sold off, right, to different plantations, her family broken up, she decides to run away. She makes it to New York, and she's able to escape using this Underground Railroad. But then she makes a momentous decision, really a heroic decision. Harriet Tubman decides she wants to go back and rescue as many of her family members as possible. So here in the 1840s, Harriet Tubman decides to turn around after just gaining her freedom and go back into the South to get her parents, to get her children, as many of them as she can find, and take those people out to freedom, right? Out of slavery to freedom. She does this more than 19 times. And think about what she's risking every time she does this. If Southerners catch her, she'll either be sent back to slave. I mean, her runaway slave ad is up here in the upper right-hand corner, right? Describing her, saying this is who she is. Find her, send her back to me, I'll give you a reward. Well, Harriet Tubman, right, she's literally risking her life every time she does this. If they find out that she's the one that's helping people escape, she'll be tried and put to death. But she does it over and over and over again anyways, right? She's just that much of a hero to stand up against this institution of slavery, to want to get people their freedom. And she actually is able to free more than 300 people from freedom, to freedom, right? Including her own family members, many of her own family members. So Harriet Tubman is kind of one of these agents, right, that's working on this Underground Railroad, helping people escape, helping guide people out of the South into the North. And of course, Northerners know this, right? She lives in New York now. She openly talks about her trips to the South. She raises money by going around speaking about it, right? So Northerners know she's doing this, and they won't do anything about it. it's grating to Southerners, right? They hate this idea that Northerners are kind of flaunting these laws. That's why they're calling for this tougher Fugitive Slave Act. They want local officials in New York to arrest Harriet, put her in jail for what she's doing, because in their minds, Southerners' minds, slave owners' minds, she's stealing property, right? So here in 1849, 1850, we see there's a lot of problems, right? And this problem is getting pretty big. But as this map shows, right, this Underground Railroad is pretty extensive. There are slaves from all over the South that are able to find a way to the north to freedom, or sometimes to the south to freedom, like Mexico, that's officially slave free, parts of the Caribbean that are officially slave free. So here in the 1840s, 1850s, this thing called the Underground Railroad, fugitive slaves, is kind of a big problem. It's a widespread problem. But then again, it's not that big if you really stop and think about it. When you look at the numbers that are involved, out of 4 million people that are held in bondage, that are enslaved in the South, only 1,000 are actually getting away each year. So that's a very minuscule percentage of the population, right? There are more slaves just dying of natural causes each year, right, than are running away to freedom. So why are Southerners so upset about this? Why do they hate it so much? Why are they opposing this so much? Well, maybe the way to kind of think about it is the lack of control that this gives them, right? If slaves are able to run away, then it encourages other slaves to run away. By bringing somebody like Harriet Tubman back, punishing her in front of everybody else, you're basically saying there's no hope, don't even try. But when somebody like Harriet Tubman can get away and then come back and get more people and take them away, it gives hope. It takes away power for slave owners, right? And if you stop and think about it, slave owners depend on that slave labor. They've made a system that is incredibly profitable for them by owning other human beings. And every time one of those human beings runs away, they're losing value, they're losing labor, they're losing money, right? So to them, it's about a lot of things if you're a Southern slave owner. But I think also the thing to kind of keep in mind here is there's also this idea that Northerners are basically keeping your property from you, right? And it'd be like if somebody from Nevada came and stole your car and took it away from you to Nevada and declared that your car was now free of you, right? It can do, your car can belong to whoever it wants to belong to, right? We wouldn't accept that, right? We would say the people in Nevada have to get us our property back. That's how Southerners are kind of thinking of this, right? They don't see slaves as people, they see them as property, their property, and they want that property back, and they want the federal government to help them get that property back. So this, of course, is the crux of the problem in the Compromise of 1850. Northerners have said, hey, look, we're free states, we don't have slavery, so anybody that gets here is by definition free. And Southerners are saying, no, it doesn't matter where that slave goes, they're always my slave, they're always my property. So this Fugitive Slave Act gets tested just months after passing in 1850. In 1851, a place called Christiana, Pennsylvania, it's a stop on this thing called the Underground Railroad. And there is an escaped slave in this little town of Christiana. And of course, the people there, because it's neighboring a slave state of Maryland, the newspapers there put in a lot of those ads. And there are slave catchers in this town because they know this is a stop on this Underground Railroad. So pretty soon comes notice that there is a new person in town, that this escaped slave is in town, and these slave catchers notify a slave owner from Maryland just across the border of Pennsylvania, hey, your slave's here, come get him before he disappears again. So the Maryland slave owner contacts authorities in Pennsylvania and says, hey, I have word that my slave is there in the town of Christiana, go get him for me. Well, that's the way it's supposed to work under this new fugitive slave law. But the local authorities in Christiana say, no, we don't recognize the authority of the federal government to make us do this. Pennsylvania is a free state. We don't have slavery anymore. Therefore, if anybody's here, they have to be free. We're not going to go get them. So the slave owner is incensed at this, right? He's angry. He feels like the laws are being flaunted. And honestly, he's right, right? This Fugitive Slave Act is an awful law, but it does force people like the sheriff of Christiana to do the job that this slave owner wants. So in return, when the sheriff of Christiana refuses to apprehend the runaway slave, the Maryland slave owner goes to local authorities in Maryland, asks the marshals there to deputize people to go help him get his slave back from Christiana. But news arrives before the slave owner gets to Christiana. 24 men, most black men, but there's a few white men in the crowds as well, block the entrances to Christiana when the slave owner shows up. They're armed. The slave owner and the deputies and the slave owner's son are all armed. In the end, there's a confrontation on the road into Christiana. The slave owner saying, I want to come into town to get my runaway slave. The people of Christiana saying, there can't be a slave here because we're a free state. Everybody's free. Therefore, you can't do this. A confrontation erupts. Shots are fired. Pretty soon, the slave owner is dead. The son and one of the deputies is wounded and have to run away. Now, of course, the Underground Railroad gets the runaway slave out of town as quickly as possible after this, but now there's a new issue. An act of murder has happened. People are dead and wounded, right? So in response, the slave owner's son contacts the local authorities in Christiana and says, hey, I have a new problem. I want the murder of my father to be taken into account here. I want the people punished for killing my father. Well, now the sheriff of Christiana has to do something, right? He has to take action here. So the sheriff of Christiana rounds up about 40 people that he thinks may have been involved in this. Now, truthfully, this is such a little town, everybody knows who was involved in this, right? Nobody was trying to hide their identities here. Everybody knows who was involved in this shootout that killed a slave owner from Maryland and seriously wounded his son and one deputy from Maryland. But in the end, trials are held in the jurisdictions within the place where the crime happened. So that means the trials held in Christiana. The jury of people quickly find everybody innocent. So if you're a Southerner, you think something horrible has just happened here. Besides somebody being murdered, a group of people just got away with murder. Far from enforcing this fugitive slave law, Northerners are openly defying it, refusing to comply. Southerners are just incensed at this, right? And what we kind of see is everybody's pretty upset about what's happened here, right? A northern newspaper, the Cleveland Democrat, says this is the first horrible tragedy which has taken place under the fugitive slave law. We had expected such a catastrophe before this, and we fear it is but the beginning of a series of riots which will end as it has begun in blood. So for a lot of Northerners, this is what we thought was going to happen. This slave law is a bad idea. We're free territories. If people get here, they're free. You can't make us change our mind. A Maryland newspaper looks at it a little different, right? The Baltimore Clipper said that a most foul and damning outrage has been perpetrated upon the highly respected citizens of the Commonwealth, right? Somebody's been murdered here while honestly and lawfully endeavoring to repossess themselves of their property. And that's the big thing, right? Is how Southerners kind of always portray themselves here, right? And the circumstances called loudly for some prompt retributive justice, right? Somebody just got away with murder. But a Florida newspaper maybe shows us just how far things are starting to get here, right? How things are starting to spin out of control. Look at what it says about this event that is covered in most newspapers across the United States. Is such guilt to be tolerated? Are such assassinations to be repeated? If so, the sword of civil war is already unsheathed, right? So they're already thinking about these things in terms of national, not local issues, right? They're already thinking about this as, well, Northerners killed a Southerner, therefore all Northerners are guilty of this, right? Northerners now see all Southerners as slave owners, always trying to get their way, always trying to get their property back, even if that property is a human being that deserves freedom, right? So these lines are starting to be drawn, and they're starting to go deep, right? They're starting to distrust each other as whole regions of the country, right? In response to the Christiana riot, as it becomes known, in response to these slave catchers operating in the North, a bunch of northern states, including Massachusetts, start passing what are called bloodhound bills. They say that, look, local people can't go around and apprehend people off the streets. You cannot help federal officials get enforce these laws. We don't believe in them. Essentially, they're trying to nullify federal laws like Southerners have tried to nullify federal laws in the past, right? Well, this gets tested here in 1851. In Boston, a runaway slave using the Underground Railroad by the name of Thomas Sims has been identified as being in Boston. Slave catchers see him on the streets, recognize him from the ads that they've read, and they go to federal authorities in Boston and say, "Look, you have to help us get this slave back, right? So we can collect our reward." Well, the military, the commander there in Boston has to agree to this, right? These guys are calling him on these federal laws. Local authorities won't help at all, but federal officials are obligated under the Fugitive Slave Act to get involved, right? So 300 soldiers are called out to escort these slave catchers as they grab Thomas Sims off the streets and send him back to slavery. Thomas Sims is in a free state that doesn't have slavery, hasn't had slavery in 50, 60 years, right? And now he's being sent back to slavery. Now, the people of Massachusetts can't do anything about this, right? They're not going to attack U.S. Army soldiers. But when the soldiers march by with Thomas Sims to put him on a ship to send him back to the South in slavery, they do kind of treat it like a funeral procession. They drape black flags over their houses and over their fences. They stand with black banners. They lower flags to half mast. They say something horrible has just happened here, right? And when news of this gets out, the Massachusetts passes another law saying it's an offense to actually enforce this fugitive slave law, right? That they're going to make it against the law to enforce the law. And this, of course, just makes things even more divided than they were before. As we can kind of see, the nation's kind of starting to spiral out of control here. And then we have a moment, right? One of those crystallizing moments that happens every once in a while in American history. In 1852, a woman that's kind of caught up in all these reform movements of the 1830s, right? She's the daughter of one of these ministers, Lyman Beecher, right? Uh, she's grown up in these reform movements, right? And of course, one of the reform movements that she's been very involved with is the anti-slavery movement. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe by the 1850s is a good writer. She's written a lot of little articles for magazines and newspapers. She's kind of had to hide her identity as a woman and use men's name to get published, but she's a very popular author here. And in 1850s, she begins working on a book that takes all those accounts of people like Frederick Douglass and the ones written by Thomas Clarkson and Benjamin Drew, and she fictionalizes it, right? She takes all these things that have happened to a whole bunch of people and makes it all happen to one character, a guy by the name of Uncle Tom. And in this book, Harriet Beecher, it vividly, just like Frederick Douglass does in his autobiography, his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, she vividly describes all the horrible things that happen on Southern plantations, especially how black people on plantations are pitted against other black people, right? The easiest way to keep yourself from being punished by the owner is to be the owner's favorite, right? So he won't punish you, but he'll have you punish other slaves, right? She brings out all these horrible stories, right? The slave owner that she depicts in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Simon Legree, becomes a synonym for villain for the next 50, 60 years, right? People just have to say, you're a real Simon Legree, and you know you've just said something pretty awful. The character Simon Legree was just such an awful person and did such horrible things, right? So this book takes off when it first appears in 1852. It's only going to be sold in the North, right? Southerners that get their hands on it are going to call it a bunch of lies, just like they did to Thomas Clarkson, Benjamin Drew, and even Frederick Douglass, right? But Northerners read it, eat this thing up, more than they had those true accounts like Frederick Douglass's account. Because here in Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's fictional, right? You can make things that didn't happen happen. And Harriet Beecher is able to kind of control the narration of events and really kind of expose all the horrible issues of slavery. And Northerners eat it up. A lot of Northerners that were on the fence, weren't sure whether they were really against slavery or not, suddenly are saying, I think it's bad. I think it's something we need to get rid of, right? Or if it, maybe not get rid of it, maybe they're not abolitionists yet, but they can definitely start to see the expansion of slavery as a bad thing. Within 10 years, by the early 1860s, more than 2 million copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin has been sold. It is one of the most widely read books in the United States in the 1850s, right? So Harriet Beecher Stowe becomes famous, and a lot of Northerners start waking up to the issue of slavery. Right? They've tried to ignore it. They tried to just kind of push past it and just say, "Well, it doesn't matter. I don't know what's going on. We don't have slavery here. I don't know if it's really as bad as people say." Right? That Southern propaganda is kind of working on a lot of Northerners. Right? But here in this book, she's explaining these things so vividly with so much detail. And she's putting it in such moral terms that what's happening here is so awful, it has to stop, that a lot of Northerners that wanted to ignore this really feel they can't. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln is going to be holding an event at the White House, and Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to be one of the people he asked to attend. And when he sees her in the room, he goes up and introduces himself, right? And he says, and he opens his introduction by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Now, he's not blaming her for starting the Civil War, but what he's trying to point out here is that she's the one that convinced Northerners it was time to take a stand, right? So here in the 1850s, there's a lot happening, and it's happening quick. Northerners are going to try and continue to find some middle ground here. They're going to try and ignore these issues. But people like Beecher Stowe, people like Thomas Sims, people like Harriet Tubman, they won't let it go away, right? People like Frederick Douglass are out every day giving a speech saying, "What are you doing about this? This problem's getting worse, not better. We have to do something." So this country's kind of moving here. But what we really need is a catalyst, right, to really kind of set all this off. And as a matter of fact, two things are about to happen in this country that make all that happen. One is a piece of legislation out of the United States Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The other is a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott decision. And both of those things are going to start to bitterly divide this country, even to the point where people can start killing each other, not just on an individual basis like in the Christiana riot, but on a regional basis now. So to kind of explain this, we'll turn to the election of 1852, kind of unfolding as Northerners are starting to read Harriet Tubman's book and starting to kind of come to grips with whether they can allow slavery to exist or not, right? Or whether they want it to expand, if at all. So in the 1852 election, uh, the political parties have a big problem, right? The Democratic Party was already split in 1848, and it hasn't gotten any better here in 1852. They have to do kind of what the Whigs did the previous election, ignore the issue of slavery, right? If they embrace slavery, they'll make Southerners happy, but Northern Democrats won't be happy. If they oppose slavery, it'll be the reverse of that. So basically, they find a candidate, Franklin Pierce, who won't take a stand on anything, right? And basically, he just says, let's just keep going the way we're going, ignore everything, and it'll all work out in the end. Again, kick the can down the road, so to speak. The Whig Party, however, again tries to do what has worked in the past, find a war hero. They find the other great general in the Mexican War, Winfield Scott, and run him as a candidate. But this guy isn't a Southern slave owner. He's a Northerner, and he's very much said he's against slavery. So the Whig Party, even though it also officially doesn't have a stance, its candidate does, right? And he's very unliked. He's not a fun person to be around. He's very abrasive and kind of tells people what he thinks they should do and how they should do it. He kind of thinks he's the guy in charge and people should listen to him. So not maybe the best choice to run as a politician is an active military general who's used to getting his way. This new party, the Whig or the former Whigs in the Free Soil Party, also has a problem. They're pretty clear on their stance on not allowing slavery to expand, But the Free Soil Party's been taken over by more abolitionists, right? John Hale from New Hampshire gets the nomination for the Free Soil Party, but he is actively pushing for abolition. So even the Free Soil Party is having trouble kind of appealing to the masses, if you will, trying to expand their message beyond their core constituency. And in the 1852 election, we see kind of an interesting result. The Whig Party is starting to collapse here. Now, they get a lot of votes, don't get me wrong, right? They get more than 40% of the votes, but they don't have a clear majority in almost any part of the country. Just in kind of Kentucky, Tennessee, the very central portion of the United States, and then up in the Northeast, where their Whig policies that kind of defend industry are still well respected. For the most part, the Democrats win by a landslide, and part of this can be explained by that Free Soil Party. Abolitionists have run to it, and even though it's a small party and it only gets 5% of the vote, that 5% is all in the North. A lot of states like New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio would have gone to the Whig candidate and really balanced all of this out more if the Free Soil Party didn't exist. But a lot of Northerners feel they can't vote for the for the Whig Party anymore. They join the Free Soil Party because the Whig Party just won't take a stance on the big issue of the day. What are we going to do about slavery? Does it exist everywhere? Does it exist nowhere? Is there some middle ground that we need to work out, right? Nobody wants to talk about it. So in the end, people choose the party that isn't talking about it at all, the Democratic Party. But as I've said a couple times already, that doesn't solve the problem. It's just getting worse. So here in 1852, Franklin Pierce becomes the next president of the United States. And as I've already pointed out, it kind of shows his election kind of proves that a lot of Americans just don't want to deal with the issue of slavery. They'd rather focus on something easier, right? That's kind of a national trait we have as a country, where we like to kind of put off the really hard decisions until they absolutely can't be avoided anymore. Well, that's kind of what his election is about. A lot of Americans just don't want to deal with these hard problems. They know it's going to cause a lot of problems, so they ignore it and hope it goes away, which of course it doesn't. And that is seen nowhere more clearly than what happens just after Franklin Pierce's election. In 1853, after Pierce becomes president, that congressman from Illinois, or that senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, proposes something that normally wouldn't be very controversial, wouldn't cause very many problems. He proposes an infrastructure project. He wants to help fund a transcontinental railway, right? He wants to help connect California to the rest of the country, help move all that gold from California to the east, help move people from the east out to places like California and Oregon. That makes sense. That is something almost every American can agree on. To help do that, however, you need money, right? And one of the easiest ways to raise money is have states pay taxes, right? So Stephen Douglas proposes, let's build a railroad from Chicago, Illinois, his home state, so this will help his home state, all the way out to San Francisco, right, on the West Coast in California. And we'll help fund it by creating the state of Nebraska. Nebraska is ready to become a state. The territory just had enough people. It's a part of the old Louisiana Purchase territory, so it's going to be a free state. We already know that. Let's create this big state of Nebraska, and then they can help fund this new railroad that'll go through their state. Well, for a lot of Americans, this makes sense, especially Northerners, right? Adding another Northern state makes them happy. Once again, it'll give them control of the Senate. They've already got control of the House, so they can pass laws that are good for Northerners. But in the end, it fails, right? Something that should be pretty much a no-brainer, a done deal, fails. Southerners in the Senate say, no, we're not voting for it. We refuse. And of course, ties in the Senate always go to the vice president, and the vice president in this case is a slave-owning Southerner. He votes against this Nebraska Act as it's known in 1853. So Northerners that dominate the House of Representatives push for this to pass. It fails in the Senate. So Stephen Douglas, who thinks that this transcontinental railroad is absolutely critical to the growth of the nation, the growth of the economy, right? And a lot of Democrats and Whigs, especially Northerners, agree with him, right? They want this thing to happen. So he revamps things in 1854, right? And he needs to, because Southerners, led by this guy, David Atchison, John Calhoun died just right after the Compromise of 1850 was passed. So David Atchison kind of fills that void for Southern leadership. He's a slave owner from Missouri, and he's a senator in the U.S. Senate. And he says, right, he's one of the guys that helps keep this Nebraska territory from coming in as a state. He said he'd rather see Nebraska sink in hell than become a free state. So, if you're Stephen Douglas, this is what you have to deal with, right? You have to get Southerners like David Atchison on board. And Southerners like David Atchison do not want to see more northern states right now. They're having trouble finding territory to expand into for slave owners, right? More and more territories are turning into northern states instead of southern states. There's a chance that the New Mexico territory may end up becoming a slave state, but there's almost as many northerners moving there as southerners. So this is a challenge, right? This is a problem. So Douglas does what everybody's been doing. He tries to find a compromise. He goes back to his old idea of popular sovereignty. He says, all right, I tell you what, let's let the people of the Nebraska territory decide for themselves what kind of state they're going to be. Let's use that as our new model for admitting states to the Union. But this is kind of an issue, right? The Missouri Compromise says that Nebraska is going to be a free state no matter what. The national government's already agreed to that. Douglas is basically walking that back, saying the Missouri Compromise doesn't exist. All territories left in the United States, virtually half the country, have to be decided one at a time what kind of states they're going to be. And to kind of make this more palatable, because Southerners know Nebraska's already been settled by Northerners, it's going to be a free state, Douglas agrees to cut off the southern part of this state of Nebraska into a new territory called Kansas. And that's the one that'll be up for grabs. Nebraska will come in as a free state, but this territory, Kansas, can be settled by either Southerners or Northerners, and it'll decide for itself under popular sovereignty what kind of state it'll be, free or slave. Now, the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, says this is a dumb plan, right? This is just going to cause problems. It'll make Southerners and Northerners compete and fight against each other like they did in Christiana, like they've done in other places, and it'll cause more problems. He says, no, I am not okay with this. I don't want anybody in Congress to vote for this. Southerners, led by David Atchison, march into the White House and say, look, you either support this plan, you support the idea that Kansas can become a slave state, or we're never voting for the Democratic Party again. Now, Franklin Pierce is under the idea that he can run for a second term here. He wants to be popular. He wants to control the Democratic Party. And if he doesn't go along with this, he'll lose control. He won't be able to run for president again in 1856. So Franklin Pierce caves, right? He gives in to Southern demands, and he agrees, okay, let the Kansas territory become an open territory. Instead of following the Missouri Compromise line, we'll allow the people of Kansas to decide what kind of state it's going to be. The problem just got worse. So here in 1853, 1854, the country suddenly lurches in a new direction, right? All the old rules are kind of thrown out the window, so to speak. And a lot of Northerners, especially Northern Whigs that weren't okay with the expansion of slavery, those Free Soilers especially, right? They see this as a plan, a Southern plot, if you will, for Southerners to spread slavery everywhere, to gain as much power and control as possible so that they can undo Northern anti-slavery laws. In the end, Northern state governments won't approve this new law, right? The Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, in the end, it doesn't matter, right? This is a federal law determining what happens to federal territories. So the state governments don't have a lot of power or control here. But the fact is, a lot of Northerners say, no, don't go behind it. Don't support this bill. And in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act barely passes the House of Representatives. Just enough Northern Democrats and a few Northern Whigs join on to make this possible with every Southern Whig and Southern Democrat. But a lot of Northerners kind of see this as a betrayal, that the Whig Party and the Democratic Party are serving Southern interests rather than Northern interests, right? In response, a new political party made up of Northern Whigs that are kind of upset with what's happening, Northern Democrats who are upset, and of course those Free Soilers that had already made a decision on how they felt about slavery, they form a new party called the Republican Party. So in 1854, this Republican Party is essentially the Free Soil Party, just rebranded so that Whigs and Democrats can join. But it is still a Northern party, right? It's still talking about the same thing Whigs and Federalists have been talking about for 60 years in this country, right? But it does take a clear stand on slavery. Not that it's getting rid of slavery, but there should not be another slave state, right? That is the one thing that comes clear out of this new party, besides supporting kind of the growth of Northern industry, right, and Western expansion and free land out West. This Republican Party is dedicated to the idea that there should not be any more slave states, that in the end, the North should control the national government and decide kind of the fate of slavery one way or another. And a lot of Northerners can see this as maybe the best solution to things. Southerners, on the other hand, are alarmed by this, right? They see the Democratic Party in the North weakening, the Whig Party in the North weakening. It means Southern Democrats are in a little bit of trouble here. The North is starting to kind of coalesce around a message of definitely maybe not abolition, but to limit the power of slavery. But to a Southerner, it's the same thing. Because if they're just going to be northern states, more northern states in Congress, Southerners know that eventually they'll just be controlled by the North, right? That they won't be able to protect slavery any longer. So here in 1854, the stakes are pretty high. If you're a Southerner, you have to prove you can expand slavery. You need to make Kansas, right next to the slave state of Missouri, a slave state. Because if you can't get Kansas, it means you can't get anywhere. If you're a Northerner, well, now you're kind of dedicated to this idea, well, maybe not get rid of slavery, but we don't want to make it bigger and worse, right? We want to keep it from expanding. So people like William Seward, a one-time Whig, now a Republican, he's from New York. He says, there's no escaping your challenge, Southerners, right? I accept it on behalf of the cause of freedom. We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right. So again, this moral idea, right, that Northerners are cleaning up the country, making it a better place. They're going to set up things called immigrant aid companies, excuse me, all through the North to help people that want to move out west to places like Kansas get there, right? Maybe you're too poor. You can't afford land out west. You can't afford to travel out west. We'll help you out. You just have to agree to go there and vote to make it a free state, not a slave state. So Northerners have the people, they have the money, they have the ambition to do this. The only problem is they're farther away. It's going to take months for people from places like New York and Massachusetts to get to Kansas. Who can get there immediately? Southerners, especially people from Missouri, a slave state. And that's actually what happens. David Atkinson, senator from Missouri, U.S. senator from Missouri, says this, right? When the Kansas-Nebraska Act passes in 1854. The game must be played boldly, he writes. If we win, we carry slavery to the Pacific Ocean. If we can get Kansas, then we can get the next state, then the next state, then the next state. But Atkinson also understands the reverse is true, right? He says if we fail, if we can't even get Kansas, then it means we're going to lose Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and every place else. That eventually Northerners will undo all of this, right? More Northerners will move into Missouri and they'll vote to make Missouri a free state. They'll do that in Arkansas. They'll do that in Texas. And once they do that, then it's only a matter of time before slavery is gone everywhere. So here in 1854, the stakes are pretty high for both sides, and they're both motivated. And what we see is in the next years, people flood into Kansas, we see the beginnings of an actual civil war. For about the next decade or so, Kansas is going to be a civil war within the larger civil war on a national scale. Northerners and Southerners are going to be fighting each other, killing each other in Kansas for the next year and a half. It starts because it becomes, the stakes are so high here, nobody wants to lose. And when nobody wants to lose, it means they'll do anything to win. And that happens in 1855. Under the kind of auspices of people like David Atkinson, people from Missouri are encouraged to cross over into the Kansas territory and vote in their elections. Even though they don't live there, they're not going to stay there. They just come, they vote, and then they go back home to Missouri. Today, we would call that election fraud, right? It was kind of common back in the 19th century for elections to kind of be of dubious reliability. Uh, but this was pretty evident, right? Everybody understood that there were people that didn't live in the territory voting in mass scale, by the thousands, as a matter of fact. But when the votes were tallied up, it was pretty obvious that slave owners from Missouri had voted in huge numbers. They controlled the new territorial government. They'd be the ones writing the Constitution for the new state of Kansas when it's ready to go. Only a few northern candidates, free soil candidates, people opposed to slavery, were able to kind of win in this election, and only in areas where there were already big communities, established communities of Kansas, where they'd noticed people from outside the territory coming in. But this cheating was so widespread, it was so obvious that the federal governor, a U.S. military, a U.S. Army officer, he said, "Look, this cheating is so huge, we need to have new elections." And in the new elections, they were called so quickly, people from Missouri weren't able to come back and vote in that election. So this time, northern candidates, free soil candidates, were elected. So essentially, we've had two elections, and the result is two different groups of people elected in these elections. But they both have some problems. The first election is a legitimate election, right? It was called for. The federal government called for it, and it happened. But there was a lot of voter fraud when people from Missouri voted in it. The second election wasn't called by the federal government, so it's not a legitimate election, but it is fair, right? The actual people living in Kansas are the ones that voted in it. So we have what often happens here. We have two different governments, right? The slave-backed government meets in Lecompton, Kansas, and they establish a territorial government free for pro-slavery, right? The Northerners meet in Topeka, Kansas, and there they write a constitution or a territorial government that'll be based on anti-slavery, a free state, right? So by January of 1856, you have two competing governments in Kansas, right? The official one that was illegally elected by pro-slavery forces from Missouri, they meet in Lecompton, Kansas. The other that is created by actual residents of Kansas in a fair election, it's unofficial, right? It wasn't actually called by the federal government. But both of these governments declare themselves the leaders of Kansas, the ones that are going to write the government, and they won't listen to each other, which means the people of Kansas are split just like their government is. One government for slaveholders or pro-slavery forces, and the other for free soil or anti-slavery forces. And that means we end up with a bunch of violence, right? To kind of prove their point that they're not happy with what's going on here. When this Topeka government starts kind of chasing off Missouri people that are trying to still kind of defend pro-slavery forces, trying to gain control of the government of Kansas, members of the Topeka government send people out to chase off people from Missouri, right? And chase them back into Missouri to get them out of the territory of Kansas. That happens around the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Well, in response, David Atkinson, senator from Missouri, goes and raises troops in Missouri, a militia, right? We would today call it just a bunch of militia, right? He raises a bunch of people. They stop at a federal armory in Missouri to get weapons, and they march on the town of Lawrence, Kansas. They say, hey, look, you attack some of our people, you free soilers in Kansas, well, blood for blood. Let us purge ourselves of all abolition emissaries. We're going to get rid of these free soilers in Kansas. And they attack the town of Lawrence, Kansas, basically burn it to the ground. People are wounded. People are hurt in this altercation, right? And in May of 1856, right, this has gotten bad, right? That's when the town of Lawrence, Kansas is attacked. Americans are attacking Americans here. So in response to all of this comes one of the kind of weirder moments here, right? A northerner by the name of John Brown, uh, he's been involved in a lot of this religious kind of fervor in the North for decades now. And he honestly feels he has a connection to God, that God speaks to him. Well, when news of the Kansas being up for grabs happens, John Brown, who's dedicated himself to a lot of these reform movements, but especially the anti slavery movement, decides it's imperative that Kansas be a free state. So he and some of his people that listen to him and his family members, especially his older sons, they're going to move to Kansas to make sure it becomes a free state. But before they ever get there, they hear about the attack on Lawrence, Kansas in early May of 1856. And that's when he decides, hey, look, eye for an eye. They just attacked the town of Lawrence, hurt and killed people. Let's go and do the same thing to these Southerners, right? These pro-slavery people. So when he gets to Canvas, he, a couple of his sons, and a couple of his friends that have moved with him go in the middle of the night and attack farmsteads, places where they know there are pro-slavery people in the little towns of Osawatomie and Pottawatomie, Kansas. And they drag these people out in the middle of the night outside their homes, and John Brown uses a sword to cut off their heads or kill them in other ways. So he massacres 5 people in the nights of May 24th, May 25th, 1856. And news of these killings goes across the country, right? Americans are killing each other now over the issue of slavery, whether it should be in Kansas or not. And of course, Southerners are calling for the arrest of this guy that's perpetrated these horrible massacres, killing people in the middle of the night, invading their homes and terrorizing their families, right? Today, we would call him a terrorist, right? Uh, but when they go to arrest him, they can't find him. He's used the Underground Railroad to escape, right? So once again, a lot of Southerners feel like Northerners are getting away with something, right? That they're getting away with murder. Of course, Northerners feel like, hey, Southerners are terrorizing Northerners by burning down the town of Lawrence, Kansas, by holding illegal elections, right? So you can see that this country is rapidly spinning out of control. And it's being followed everywhere, right? What's happening in Kansas is dominating the discussion here. And in 1856, after news of Lawrence, Kansas has happened, as news of the massacres in Ottawatomie and Pottswatomie are coming out, it even happens in the nation's capital. Charles Sumner is a northerner from Massachusetts, and he has been a vociferous opponent of the South. He's constantly been saying it's Southern slave owners that are causing all these problems. If Southern slave owners like David Atkinson weren't leading all these troubles, Kansas would be fine, right? If Southerners didn't want to have more slave territory, thing would be fine, right? If they just stay in their slave states, we wouldn't have these problems. Well, he's made some of these attacks, right, very personal. He calls out a guy by the name of Andrew Butler from South Carolina, a slave owner representing the state of South Carolina in the U.S. Senate. He says that it's people like Butler that are causing all the problems. Well, Butler kind of laughs this off, but it is a personal attack, right? Butler's honor has kind of been smirched here by Charles Sumner, but Butler decides not to do anything about it. Who does decide to do something about it, however, is Butler's cousin, who's a representative for South Carolina in the House of Representatives. His name's Preston Brooks. The next day, after hearing that his cousin, Butler, was called out by Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, Brooks decides he better do something. He's going to stand up for the family. He's going to defend their honor, right? He's going to be that paternalistic figure for his family. So Preston Brooks marches from the U.S. House to the other end of the Capitol building to the U.S. Senate, walks into the U.S. Senate, asks a bunch of Southerners, hey, who's this guy, Charles Sumner? Where is he at? They point him out. He goes up behind Sumner's back and starts beating Sumner across the head with his walking stick. Now, when I say walking stick, it's not like maybe what we're used to today. It is much more akin to what a bat is like today. It's a very thick, strong piece of wood, and Preston Brooks used it to strike Sumner across the head about 30 times. In the end, Sumner collapses on the floor. Many fear he's dead. He's been killed by Preston Brooks. He hasn't, but he's going to suffer some pretty traumatic brain injuries because of all of this, right? But in the end, this is a horrific moment, right? Congress people, members of the U.S. Congress attacking each other in Congress while it's meeting, right? Uh, but they can't actually try Preston Brooks. Most Northerners want him to pay for attacking somebody, especially somebody defenseless like Charles Sumner, who's just writing at his desk when this happens. They want Preston Brooks to go to jail. But a quirk of the laws of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress in general is that crimes in the Congress are settled by Congress. And since it's in the Senate where this happened, the Senate controls what happens to Preston Brooks. And the best Northerners can do is get a fine against Brooks of $300, right? They can't send him to jail because the Senate is balanced and the vice president is a Southerner, so he's going to vote against anything that punishes Brooks. In the end, that $300 fine isn't even going to be paid by Brooks. He's going to get money from Southerners that are going to pay for all of that, right? And then he's going to even get more walking sticks. A lot of Southerners see him as a hero, as standing up from the South, finally getting back at these Northerners who are constantly attacking them. And Preston Brooks is going to be given dozens of walking sticks that people write notes that say, use it on another Yankee, right? Use it on another Northerner, teach them a lesson, right? So we kind of see that this country is spinning out of control here, right? These fights are becoming personal. They're starting to spread across the country. They're even happening in our nation's capital. There are even stories in the 1850s of Northerners starting to carry guns to Congress because they're afraid they're going to be attacked by Southerners like Preston Brooks. So the animosity is really growing here in the 1850s. And you can kind of see the breakdown here, right? A Virginia newspaper, the Richmond Enquirer, said the act was good in conception, so it was a good idea what Preston Brooks had, better in execution, actually got away with it, and best of all in consequences, it shut up Charles Sumner, who's going to be out of the Senate for a couple of years recovering from his wounds. A New York newspaper, however, kind of said it this way, and this kind of sums up how a lot of Northerners are starting to feel here. Has it come to this, that we must speak with bated breath in the presence of our Southern masters? Are we to be chastised as they chastise their slaves? A cartoon that runs with these kind of stories coming out of Northern newspapers. This one's from the New York Times, really does kind of sum up how some Northerners are seeing things, right? Charles Sumner is making arguments here, trying to explain why slavery is a bad thing, and people like Preston Brooks just attacks him to shut him up. That Southerners can't handle the truth, that they can't handle that what they're doing is wrong and needs to end, that it's okay for them to own people is their opinion, and they're willing to fight for it. They're willing to hurt people over it. And as you can kind of see by the faces in the background, Southerners like what they're seeing. They're not stopping this from happening. They're encouraging it, blocking it, making it impossible for Northerners to come to Charles Sumner's defense. So this country is bitterly divided over these events that I've just talked about, right? And they're causing Northerners and Southerners to not just distrust each other, but to actually dislike each other. And then comes another moment, right? So again, just think about it. We started this lecture in 1850, and here we are in 1856. We've covered 6 years of time, but so many things have happened that are dividing the country. Well, the last one we're going to talk about today is this event that's maybe not as it's not as immediate in its controversy as the Sumner Brooks affair is, right? And what I mean by that is Sumner Brooks affair, as it becomes known, it gets people angry on both sides, right? This one really does just anger one part of the country, the Dred Scott decision. It really convinces a lot of Northerners that were hoping to kind of avoid all this. They were trying to kind of see past these differences between the North and the South to see that maybe there isn't a way to compromise anymore. Maybe they're just going to have to make a ultimate decision here on what to do with slavery in the South. And that, of course, is the Dred Scott decision. So to kind of show you how important this Dred Scott decision is, we need to look at what else happens in 1856 at the same time. And that, of course, is a national election. We have to choose a president, right? Franklin Pierce ends up not being able to run for president. Northerners just won't have him anymore. Even Northern Democrats say, hey, look, it looks like you're on the side of the South. You're not going to represent our interests. We don't want you. The Republican Party, on the other hand, this new party that's emerged from the Free Soil Whigs and Democrats in the North, is absolutely growing here. It controls almost 70–80% of the northern state governments are now run by Republican party members, right? So it's growing. Not every state in the North is controlled by the Republicans, but they are growing. They're, in just 2 years, they have become a political force in the North. The Whig Party is dying quickly, and the Democrats are almost in trouble here from the Republicans. So in the 1856 election, the Republican Party runs somebody for president that epitomizes exactly what they're all about. He's a hero of the war with Mexico. His name's John Fremont. He's one of those army captains that went out and captured California for the North, or for the country, right? And then he stayed there. He got rich, finding gold on property that he bought, and he's the epitome of the self-made man, right? He wasn't born into a wealthy family, but now he is wealthy because he worked hard and did it on his own, right? That's the theory here that they're going to put out, right? That's the idea that Fremont represents for Northern Republicans. So they have their candidate, a guy that represents what they think the country's all about. Southerners, on the other hand, they know they've got a problem. They can't run a Southern candidate because Northern Democrats won't have it. But of course, Northern Democrats can't run a candidate that's anti-slavery because Southern Democrats won't have it. So the Democratic Party has the same problem it's been having since 1848. They have to find somebody that can appeal to both the North and the South of their party, and it's almost impossible to do it. The only candidate they can both agree on is a guy that hasn't even been in the country for 4 years, James Buchanan. He's been our ambassador to the United Kingdom, to Great Britain, during those 4 years. So he's not a part of all of these controversies that have been going on. He hasn't taken a stand on the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He hasn't taken a stand on the Sumner-Brooks affair. He can stay out of all of that. And what the Democratic Party officially attaches to its platform, the ideas that it supports, is this idea of popular sovereignty, that all these territories out west need to decide for themselves whether they're going to be slave states or free states. Now, of course, the Republican Party has just the opposite philosophy. There should be no more slave states, right? So things are getting pretty clear here, right? The Republican Party is starting to represent the interests of just the North. The Democratic Party is trying to represent the interests of both the North and the South, but it really can't, right? They can only represent everybody's interest by not representing anybody's interest, is kind of the best way to look at this. The Whig Party, the Free Soil Party, they're essentially gone by now, right? There's very little political middle ground anymore. What we kind of see happen in this election, however, is something kind of surprising. Some northern states are still trying to find that middle ground. They're trying to find a way to kind of patch over these differences. 3 northern states, Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois, none of which are controlled by the Republican Party, actually vote for the Democratic Party. Try to find that middle ground again, right? But when we drill down into the numbers a little bit, you kind of see actually how close this election was. In electoral votes, it wasn't that close, right? Buchanan and the Democrats got about 60% of the vote, and the Republicans got about 40%. But when you look at the popular vote, that's really where it matters. Because what's left of the Whig Party that didn't join the Republican Party, the American Party, the Know-Nothings as we know them as, right, popularly, they ran their own candidate, right? Millard Fillmore, the guy from the 1840 or 1850 death of Zachary Taylor, right? Who filled out Taylor's term. He runs as kind of a compromise candidate, as somebody that wants to represent Northern interests but not stop or not have a position on slavery. Well, there's still a lot of Northerners that want to find that as a middle ground, right, as a compromise position. And Fillmore gets about 800,000 votes, almost all of which are in the North. If that candidate had not run, those votes would have gone to the Republicans, and that election would have been way closer. As a matter of fact, if you stop and look at it, Fremont could have been president if he had just gotten Pennsylvania and either Illinois or Indiana. That's just how powerful the North's become politically here. There are so many people living in the North. There's so many electoral votes in the North that they don't even have to have most of the country anymore. They just need all the North to vote one way. If all the northern states vote for one candidate, that's who's going to win the election. This is not lost on Southerners. They understand how important it is to have their guy in the White House now. It's not just enough to have the vice president be a Southerner, right, to protect them in the Senate. Those days may be gone. They're having trouble getting Kansas. New territories out west look like they're going to shift and become free territories as Northerners expand out west. Oregon's getting ready to become a state. Nevada, New Mexico territory might become a state pretty soon, and it looks like they're all going to become free states. So if you're a Southerner here, this is a pretty scary election, but you kind of breathe a sigh of relief. You dodged a bullet. You're going to have somebody in the White House that's not against slavery. You're going to have a Southern vice president presiding over the Senate to make sure that ties go your way. So you still think there's a chance here. But if you're a Northerner, you're not happy, right? You kind of feel like once again Southerners are in control, that a lot of Northerners just don't have their act together here. You need a galvanizing moment, a clarifying moment, if you will, for Northerners. Well, that happens almost immediately after the election results are in. A case had already been working its way through the judicial system in this country from the state of Missouri. A former slave by the name, or a slave by the name of Dred Scott, is suing for his freedom. Now, the story goes like this, right? Dred Scott's owner was a captain in the U.S. Army and had been sent around a lot of these territories throughout the West, especially places like Wisconsin and Iowa. That's where they had been living for years, as a matter of fact. So even though they were both from Missouri, they'd been living in these territories in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase Territory, free territories that were going to become free states. Well, at one point, I believe it's when they're living in the Iowa Territory, Iowa transitions from a territory to a state. And at that point, the captain's tour is over, right? He's no longer needed there. Iowa is now a self-governing state, no longer needs federal authority there. So the captain is making arrangements to head back to Missouri. He's going to quit the Army. He's ready to retire. He's sick and old anyways. And that's when Dred Scott comes up with a wrinkle in the plan, right? Dred Scott tells his owner, look, we've been living here in Iowa for a long time. Iowa's declared itself a free territory. Now it's going to be a free state. I'm free. And it's an interesting argument, right? Dred Scott had lived in Iowa long enough to be a citizen. And now that it was becoming a state, he would be a free citizen of the state. So is he right? Is he a free person? Well, Dred Scott's owner doesn't actually have a good answer, but he does point out that Dred Scott's wife is still back home in Missouri with the captain, the owner's wife, and that he was not going to give her freedom like Dred Scott may get his. So they work out a deal. Dred Scott and his owner will return to Missouri. Dred Scott will serve out faithfully his owner's life, right? As long as his owner's alive, Dred Scott will be a good servant, will be a good slave. And as soon as the owner dies, in his will, Dred Scott's owner will free him and Dred Scott's wife so they can have their freedom. So Dred Scott takes the best of a bad situation, goes home with his owner back to Missouri. His owner lives a couple more years, dies, and in the will, when it's read, comes the shocking news that actually he kept his word and he gives Dred Scott and his wife his freedom. So Dred Scott and his wife prepare to leave. They're free, right? The will says that they've been given their freedom. But the owner's wife decides, no, you're community property. Now that my husband's dead, I own you, and I don't give either of you your freedom. So now we have a legal issue here, right? Is Dred Scott free because of the will, the probate that's happened? Or is he actually community property and he and his wife still controlled by the owner's widow? Well, that has to be solved by local courts. So, since they live in St. Louis, which is really close to the northern state of Illinois, that's where the court case takes place. And the court in St. Louis decides that no, the will is correct. Dred Scott and his wife are free. Well, the widow doesn't like that decision, so she appeals it up to the state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court, that is dominated by slave owners, says no, no, no. Dred Scott is property. He's owned by the widow. She now owns him, and he and his wife aren't free. So now we have two courts that have made two very different decisions. So it has to go up to the next level. It goes into the federal court system, works its way through the federal court system, and in 1857 goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's where the Supreme Court makes one of the worst decisions in the history of the Supreme Court, because they say something that wasn't even part of the case, right? The case is which counts, right? Is Dred Scott and his wife community property, as the widow declares, or are they free under the terms of the will, which is essentially a legal contract? Well, the Supreme Court doesn't even take up that situation, right? They say that this court case is illegal from its very beginnings, that Dred Scott is not a person, that he can't possibly sue anybody, that he is, for all intents and purposes, a thing, not a person, which is obviously ludicrous. But the implications of this decision are huge, right? Basically, it says that escaped slaves are never people. They're always going to be slaves, somebody's property. That even when they're given their freedom, they're truly not free, right? And the implication here is that slavery could really exist everywhere. That if you're a slave owner and you want to go visit New York City, you can bring your slave with you because your slave is your property, and local laws cannot deprive you of your property without your consent. So this is a monumental mess that the Supreme Court has just made. Roger Taney and a bunch of other slave owners that dominate the Supreme Court have just thrown up into the air all of these things, right? They've called into account what the Fugitive Slave Act is all about, what local liberty laws are about, whether actual state laws that say people are not slaves actually matter or not, right? So here in 1857, when this decision comes out, a lot of Northerners make the conclusion that white Southerners are in control of this government. Sure, Northerners control the House. There's a balance in the Senate. But when you really get down to it, Southerners always get their way. Even when Northerners say we don't have slavery in our state, Southerners can still bring slavery into their state. So you see that this decision is going to make a lot of Northerners that felt that they could avoid all of this controversy, that they could just focus on kind of these more economic impacts, start changing their mind. That this is a problem that has to be answered, has to be dealt with, can't be ignored that much longer. So here in the late 1850s, as we move into this, we see this split happen, right? We're seeing the emergence of two distinct groups of people. Southerners are kind of identifying on this kind of chivalrous kind of lifestyle that Southern slave owners, this master class, kind of emulates, right? They call themselves cavaliers after 17th century English aristocracy, right? That they're the guys that run things. They're the ones in charge. They make the decisions. Northerners are being called Yankees, right? Again, they're not Americans. They're different groups of people living in the same country. Yankees are people that are just kind of about hardworking individuals, make it on your own kind of thing, right? They like this industrialization, even with all of its problems, because it's bringing a lot of wealth to a lot of different people. Definitely not everybody, but a lot of people are really kind of seeing a benefit from this system. Southerners, however, are identifying more strongly with their system of slavery than ever before. They see it as a win for them, especially that master class, the planters that own those big, huge mansions and those big, huge estates. For them, it's proof that their system works because they don't have to work. They can hire people to work. That Northerners are just interested in making money. They're not interested in running a society like Southerners are. So these competing ideologies are really at the core of what's happening here. In a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper maybe sums it up best. On the subject of slavery, it said, the North and South are not only two different people, right? They don't just have different views on they are rival, hostile people. That by this point, the late 1850s, a lot of Northerners have decided I may not be an abolitionist, but I definitely don't want this. I don't want more Kansases out there. I don't want this problem to keep getting worse than it already is. Whereas Southerners are saying, look, if we can't expand slavery, that's the same thing as saying we can't have slavery at all. To not being able to expand means the North dominates the government, and the North can eventually, if they want to, pass abolition laws. Well, that's kind of the way the government works, right? The government passes laws that the people want. If most people don't want slavery, well, then it's going to go away. But Southerners can't accept that. They've built their system on the ownership of other people, and they can't see that as a workable model of ending slavery. What do you do with 4 million people that you've brutalized, victimized, and dehumanized for almost 150 years? So some big questions here that have to be answered here, all right? They're going to tear this nation apart, as we'll see in the run-up to the 1860 election. Every election matters now, and the 1860 election is going to be the big one that tears it all apart. All right, so we'll pick it up from there next time. Thank you guys very much.